gamification and applied linguistic perspective, which has just come out. You can order them on amazon.com.uk. And you get a free PDF. Academia.edu.
I mean, that's the problem with the internet nowadays. Everything is monetized. Right? You can't go anywhere without an advertisement. So what I'm going to be talking about today, I think, picks up on a lot of the themes that people have explored in the earlier papers today. Themes of gamification, themes of ideology, and things about algorithms. But especially, I think, some of the stuff that was discussed this morning about the materiality of technology and people's kinds of their kind of favorite technological objects. I have a favorite technological object here. This is my Fitbit. And what this is it's an advanced accelerometer that measures every movement that I make. It also monitors my sleep, so it tells me where I'm tossing and turning or waking up in the middle of the night and that sort of thing. It has a memory as well, so it's also connected to my Wi-Fi scale, so it can also register my weight, my body mass index, my fat percentage, my muscle percentage. It's also connected to my Wi-Fi blood pressure. But the most important I'm not going to pass it around because I once lost it. This is my second one. I once lost it and I felt so upset. So the most important thing that this item is connected to, though, is of course my iPhone. Now I've heard people say that losing their mobile phone is sort of like losing a part of their brain. But for me, losing my phone would be more like losing a part of my body. Because it would be losing a level of awareness of my physical activities, my bodily functions, and my vital signs that I've become accustomed to in the last couple of years. So one app on my iPhone holds the accumulated information of all the meals I've eaten for the past 3 years, including calorie counts and my intake of key nutrients. Another tells me how far and how fast I've run and compares me to other men of my age. Still another, this is my Fitbit app, is wirelessly connected to my Fitbit and records every step I take, every stair I climb, and even monitors my sleep. I have an app that monitors the amount of water that I drink throughout the day. And one that gathers information from my Wi-Fi scale, keeps track of my weight, body fat percentage, and my body mass, and even one which I can use to measure my heart rate at various times during the day by placing the tip of my finger on the iPhone's camera. There's one that periodically asks me to record my mood and takes a picture of the expression on my face. And best of all, an app that contains detailed information about my genome, including my risk for contracting a host of diseases and medical conditions.
30.
Yes. The information from this app comes from a California-based company called 23andMe, to which I paid $300 US. Actually, the cost has since gone down to $99, to analyze a saliva sample and provide me a report of my disease risks and other traits, including, as it turns out, a trait that predisposes me to be a world-class sprinter. Now, this is a fact that my Nike Plus app hasn't quite gotten around to acknowledging. Not to mention a variant associated with bad driving, and this is actually true. Should I desire to go into more detail, I can use another app on my iPad that actually allows me to visualize each of my 46 chromosomes. As I'm talking to you today, the Polar H7 Bluetooth sensor strapped around my chest is measuring my heart rate variability. That is the minute changes in the spaces between my heartbeats, which has been found to be an accurate indicator of stress. And this is all on my iPad. I can actually pass this around so you can see a little part of me as I'm talking. Let me know if my heartbeat stops. So I guess the first question I should address in my talk is the question that's probably also in your mind, and that's how weird is this?
Very.
Well, as it turns out, it's not as weird as you might think. I'm not alone in this vaguely narcissistic compulsion to measure every aspect of my physical and psychological well-being. Lots of people do it. Self-tracking apps like the ones I've been describing are among the fastest growing category in the Apple iTunes Store. And a recent study by the Pew Internet and American Life Project found that 60% of American adults track some aspect of their diet, exercise, and overall fitness. Some self-tracking devices have even become quite mainstream, boosted by these kind of slick advertising campaigns from corporations like Nike. In the past few years, self-tracking and self-experimentation has burgeoned among some of the nerdier in the population into a full-fledged movement called the Quantified Self Movement, with its own online communities, face-to-face meetups in cities all over the world, and international conferences, one of which I just attended last week in Amsterdam. On the fringes of this movement are individuals who refer to themselves as body hackers. Those who believe that through self-experimentation using digital technology, they have the potential to enhance or upgrade the human body to become superhuman, as Tim Ferriss, author of The 4-Hour Body, puts it. Now, self-tracking is not really a new phenomenon. People have been creating textual representations of their bodies and their behaviors as a means to self-improvement for hundreds of years. Such texts include journals, diaries, lists, record books, charts, graphs, self-portraits in various media. One of history's most famous self-quantifiers was the American statesman Benjamin Franklin, whose face appears on the $100 bill. His autobiography records how he ended every day by reviewing a list of 13 virtues, placing a check mark next to a virtue whenever he violated it. And then there's the success story of Weight Watchers, which since 1963 has been helping people to lose weight by having them carefully track everything they eat according to a complex point system that keeps them so busy calculating that they hardly have time. And of course there's Alcoholics Anonymous, which helps people to stop drinking by teaching them how to turn their experience into texts, into sort of highly stylized stories which they narrate to one another over coffee in church basements. But a lot has changed since Franklin's time, and even since Weight Watchers began in the mid-60s. Now, new technologies of contextualization allow us to capture aspects of our bodies and our behavior that were heretofore invisible to us, and to compile, calculate, and visualize that information in multiple ways, and to transmit it to a large number of people over the internet. In the words of the cardiologist Eric Topol, for the first time in history, we can digitize humans, and the affordances and constraints offered by my digital self are rather different from those of Franklin's analog self. So today I want to focus on what this new ability we have to digitize ourselves, this new and weirdly intimate relationship that's forming between technology and our physical bodies can teach us about digital literacies, and in a more general way, about how we learn about ourselves and the world through the process of producing digital texts, in this case, texts about ourselves. To use the words of Gary Wolf, the founder of the Quantified Self movement, I'd like to explore what happens when computing goes all the way in. Related to this more philosophical question, of course, is a more practical question of what's been referred to as health literacy. Just as digital technologies have shaken up schools and classrooms, forcing us to rethink what we mean by literacy, they've also shaken up clinics and hospitals, forcing us to question the traditional notion of health literacy as simply the individual cognitive ability to process information, a definition that reminds us of the way people in our field used to talk about literacy 30 years ago. The ability to digitize the human makes it more difficult to ignore the fact that health literacy is about more than just being able to figure out the instructions on medicine bottles. It's about making meaning at particular times and particular places in order to be able to do certain things. It's about knowing how to use language and other semiotic systems to create and maintain social relationships, to enact different kinds of social identities like doctor, patient, caregiver, athlete, vegetarian, and self-quantifier, and to master certain systems of thinking, whether they be associated with Western medicine, chiropractic, yoga, the food pyramid, or the paleo diet, which, by the way, I'm on now. A large part of this, I think, involves the practices people develop for representing their own bodies, or allowing other people to represent their bodies for them in different social situations using various technologies of intertextualization, from language to pictures to numbers. Now, in the digital age, these technologies of intertextualization have become incredibly sophisticated. And this has had a major impact on things like doctor-patient communication. So when you visit a doctor nowadays, there's a good chance that your interaction will focus not on your physical body, but on some kind of textual representation of your body. The issue in such situation is not just understanding what these complex texts mean, but also in understanding how such texts fundamentally change the way you relate with your physician and the way you relate to and think about yourself and your own body. So the key focus of my talk, though, is really what happens when patients themselves, when people like us, start getting access to sophisticated, high-tech ways of making texts of their bodies, and using these texts to begin to engage in various projects of self-reflection and self-experimentation. What impact does this have on how people learn and take action around health and illness, and around corporality in general? So I'm going to organize my talk around three interrelated dimensions of literacy. I want to stress the interrelated because none of these dimensions can really be understood without considering the other dimensions. So the first has to do with the impact of new technologies on contextualization on individual behavior and behavior change, with people's ability to take action in the world, or what health promoters call self-efficacy. Next, I'd like to talk about the social dimensions of these new technologies, how they affect social relationships, social identities, how people use them to learn together. And finally, I want to address the sort of larger issue of critical health literacies, the relationship of these technologies to questions of access and power, and to larger ideological systems, what Jim calls big D discourses. So I'll start off with the most basic question, at least for people interested in health and health promotion. That is, how can digital tools like mobile phones and Bluetooth heart rate monitors and Fitbits actually help people to change their behavior? I'm particularly interested in the discursive features of the texts that these tools help us to create that make them either more or less effective. So I'll start out answering this first question with some of the kind of foundational ideas of classical cybernetics, as laid out by scholars like Norbert Wiener, Ross Ashby, Greg Walter, and Gregory Bateson back in the 1940s and 1950s. Of course, the most important idea of early cybernetics was that the workings of biological organisms, ecological systems, and many mechanical devices can be understood as a matter of communication. How they use information to adapt to changing conditions in the environment. And central to this idea is the idea of feedback, the notion that information about the results of past behavior can serve to modify future behavior. Feedback is the way a thermostat works, gathering information, probably not working very well in this room, gathering information about the temperature of the room, using that information to regulate the operation of a heater or an air conditioner. But it's also the way a lot of biological systems in the body work, to regulate things like body temperature, as shown in this diagram, as well as things like blood pressure, glucose levels, and hormone secretion. And so how do these feedback loops work when it comes to the kind of digital apps that I've introduced to you? How can tools from discourse analysis help us to understand this process? Well, to have a feedback loop, you basically need four processes to occur. Data gathering, information about some phenomena or behavior is captured and stored. Data processing, the data is transformed in some way that makes it relevant to an organism's goals. Data transmission, the process data is delivered back to the organism. And action, the process data is acted upon by the organism, which creates new data to be gathered. When all four of these processes are operating together, the system constitutes what's called a servo mechanism, consisting of a sensor, a processor, a transmitter, and an actor. An example can be seen in the app I have to help me to maintain my goal of drinking more water. Whenever I drink water, I enter the amount by tapping the screen of the phone and choosing the size of bottle that best represents the amount I drank. The program then processes that information in relation to my goal, immediately feeding back to me an image of my body, looks something like my body, an image of my body representing how much water I've drunk, motivating me to drink more if necessary. Different technologies of contextualization introduce affordances and constraints into each of these processes. iPhone apps like this one, for example, introduce a huge affordance in terms of gathering and storage of data, making it much easier for me to enter information and keep track of that information. But what I'd really like to focus on in this talk are the affordances of different technologies of contextualization when it comes to data processing. What kinds of discursive processes does the data undergo to make it more useful to me and more relevant to my needs? And I would argue that there are three key processes, which I call resemiotization, retemporalization, and recontextualization. So I take the term resemiotization from Adima, who uses it to describe how meanings change as they migrate from one semiotic mode to another. Different semiotic modes make different kinds of meaning possible. Language, for example, deals in typological meaning, the labeling of things and phenomena as particular types, a big red car. Whereas pictures allow for topological meaning, in which the viewer can actually experience different gradations of bigness and different shades of red. For most of the apps I've been talking about, the primary form of resemiotization is quantification. They take the topological experience of walking and eating and sleeping and transform them into numbers. This, of course, is very powerful because it allows me to do things like compare my behavior from one day to the next and set goals. But as much as quantification is important, many of these apps also take the further step of resemiotizing numbers into pictures, turning typological representations back into topological experiences, being able to see the amount of carbs I've eaten in relation to proteins and fats is very different from just reading a column of numbers. For me, a particularly dramatic example of this came when I received the results of my genetic test showing that I'm 1.5 times more likely to get colorectal cancer than others of my ethnicity. The way this is represented on my 23andMe app on my iPhone, however, comforted me somewhat. By putting this information into perspective, helping me to see much more dramatically that the statistics, that even with my increased risk, and that's the red bar, I'm still much more likely not to get colorectal cancer than I am to get it, thank God. I take the idea of retemporalization chiefly from Bakhtin, who developed the notion of the chronotope, to describe how different authors create different configurations of time and space within which actions are presented. Different chronotopes can either expand the scale of action or compress it. Now, the problem with most health behavior really can be boiled down to chronotopes. That is, the consequences of our negative behavior, like smoking, are usually long-term and gradual, while the positive feedback from such activities is usually immediate. Similarly, the positive feedback from positive behavior like exercise is usually a long time coming, whereas the pain and soreness are more or less immediate. So retemporalization situates information in either shorter or longer chronotopes, facilitating communication between these different timescales. It might, for example, create feedback loops that operate on shorter timescales, providing people with more immediate information about their behavior, as when my Nike Plus app, and Jackie and I were just talking about this, my Nike Plus app provides me with a congratulatory message from a famous athlete right after I finished a particularly grueling run. Or it might involve plotting long-term trends, like when the app connected to my Wi-Fi scale lets me monitor my body weight, body fat, and body mass index over time. not only allowing me to see when I'm deviating from my goal, but also helping me to turn my weight gain or loss into a kind of a narrative, yeah, that I can link to other episodes in my life. Every action, as Lemke says, occurs on multiple timescales, from the nanoseconds of neurotransmitter synthesis to moments, to days, to years, to lifetimes, all the way up to longer scale processes of planetary and universal change, all occurring in this layered simultaneity. Lemke argues that the ability of semiotic artifacts to facilitate communication between these different timescales, to, for example, help us see the relevance of what happens in a moment to our whole lives, is actually what makes learning possible. So let me give you an example from a different kind of self-tracking. And my colleagues will laugh because they probably figured I'd find some way to show a skateboarding video. So a few years ago, I did this project on skateboarders in Hong Kong. And the question I asked is, how do they manage to learn how to be skateboarders? It's really hard. And pretty early on, I noticed that almost every skateboarder I met was also into making videos of himself, skating, and then editing these videos into these sort of amazing creations that they put out on YouTube. But you know, when I went out to watch these guys skate, it didn't really look like this. It actually looked a bit more like this. So, skateboarders spend most of their time falling down when they do anything else. And you might end up like falling down 20 or 30 times before getting the trick just right and hopefully getting it on film. So what they were doing when they were making these videos was stringing together these scattered moments of success in ways that made it look like they were traveling continuously and flawlessly through the urban landscape. And gradually it became clear to me that these films weren't just to show off, that they were creating a kind of feedback loop, the key to which was the way they processed the data, transforming those hours of falling down into these narratives of success, which in turn motivated these kids to go out and subject themselves to further hours and hours of falling down. The third aspect of information processing, which creates effective servo mechanisms, is the potential for different technologies of contextualization to facilitate recontextualization, to allow us to lift behavior phenomena out of the context of one activity, transplant it into the context of another. Now here I go back to Bateson and this idea of framing. What texts mean to us and what we can do with them depends on the activity in which they're situated. Now, one thing that seems to me to characterize successful technologies for behavior change is that they facilitate reframing. One of the most common examples of such reframing is built into many of the technologies of contextualization associated with the quantified self movement is the phenomena of gamification that Alice was talking about earlier. The reframing of health behavior as a kind of competition or game. So the app GymPack, for example, allows users to earn cash rewards for going to the gym, paid for by other members of the social network who fail to live up to their commitment to exercise. Similarly, Nike Plus allows me to race with my friends, whether we're running at the same time or not. Now, Jim talks about the characteristics of good video games that engage players in the process of sort of rapid and effective learning. And many of those qualities are also characteristics of good self-tracking apps, including interactivity, their ability to customize and personalize experience, the way they provide just-in-time information, and the way they present information in multiple modes, audio, visual, textual, and tactile, to make the learning experience more embodied. Ironically, when it comes to understanding the consequences of our health behavior, the actual body is a poor mediational means compared to the texts that represent our bodily experiences in the form of words, numbers, images. So text can actually contribute to making information about our bodies feel more embodied. Another important way information is recontextualized is through turning what was originally private behavior into public behavior. Now, nearly all the apps that I use make my data available not only to me, but to some larger social network, whether it be my Facebook friends, my Twitter followers, or some specialist community associated with that particular app. In one sense, I'm communicating my information to others, and they are sometimes responding with likes or comments or indications of encouragement. But what I'm really doing is co-opting them into my servo mechanism, enlisting their help in providing further feedback for my behavior. I'm also creating the conditions for them to share their data with me. And when they do, the context in which I'm able to view my own data changes dramatically. Suddenly I'm able to compare my behavior with theirs to get an idea about the kind of behavior that's normal or desirable for different kinds of populations. Now, one of the most dramatic examples of this can be seen in online health social networks like Patients Like Me, which allow people experiencing different medical conditions to share their medical information Facebook style with other users, including clinical data about laboratory tests and treatments, as well as symptoms and side effects, which can then be aggregated with the information from hundreds of others of people with similar conditions and compared, so that talking about the protease inhibitor you're taking becomes rather like finding out what customers who bought the same book that you did are also reading on Amazon.com. Now, what this allows people to do is take their private self-experiments public. Here, for example, a patient with HIV shares his experience of taking a drug holiday in the form of charts and graphs. It also allows them to use the data of others to help them make treatment decisions for themselves. In this example, the user comes to realize that the dose of the MS drug she's been taking is lower than most other patients, and this allows her to approach her doctor with an argument for increasing her dosage. Finally, patients can participate in large-scale research on things like the effectiveness of different drugs. In fact, numerous peer-reviewed articles in medical journals have made use of data from sites like this. And so by helping us bring our data public, these technologies of contextualization help to expand our feedback loops into the larger eco-social system, so that the loop functions on the level of the individual. I give feedback to myself. On the level of the social interaction, we give feedback to each other. And on the level of the broader community, our aggregated data creates feedback for collective action and research. Which brings me to the second dimension of health literacy I'd like to talk about, and that is the social dimension, because health is social. Health is not just about being healthy. It's about being able to enact certain kinds of social identities that facilitate and communicate health. It's about being able to read healthy identities off of other people. It's about navigating the rules of society or your particular group about how to perform health and how to make health legible to one another. So the questions I want to ask here are how digital tools and practices around them help to create the social identities, social relationships, and social communities that can support health, and how do these digital tools facilitate the formation of learning communities? What does it look like when non-doctors, non-scientists start messing around with this kind of data in groups? And I think looking at the quantified self movement as a community of early adopters of these technologies is actually quite useful. Not because they're early adopters, but because they've come to develop quite a strong sense of their identity, a sense of imagined community, built around a shared set of social practices and ideologies associated with these practices. And as with other communities, these ideologies and practices are supported by discourse, by particular genres that they use to perform belonging in these communities. So like other communities, quantified selfers get together at events that they call meetups. The main activity they engage in at these meetups is what they call show and tell talks, which are usually video recorded and then uploaded to the internet just like skateboarding videos. The genre of the show and tell talk is kind of like a cross between a TED Talk and an Alcoholics Anonymous narrative. It always takes the same three-part structure. You're supposed to basically answer three questions. What did you do? How did you do it? And what did you learn? Let me give you an example from one of these talks from the San Francisco meetup group.
I'd like to take 79 minutes to share my collections of quantified self and self-tracking data. And So over the past 15 weeks, I started using the Fitbit to track my activity, my diet, and a little bit of my sleep. And I'd like to follow with 3 prime just questions. 1, what did I do? 2, how did I do it? 3, what did I learn? So what did I do? Well, I lost 40 pounds in 15 weeks. And how did I do it? It was really tracking what I did, calories I expended, and the calories I consumed. What did I learn? Well, at first, I didn't really buy into this quantified self thing. I studied data analysis in school, and I love numbers, but it wasn't until I really bought into the Fitbit, started using it every day, getting my brother and my mother connected, that I really started using it. And
So, like Narratives in Alcoholics Anonymous, learning how to tell your story with a show and tell talk is really kind of essential part of learning to be a member of this community. The 3-part structure of the AA story, what we used to be like, what happened to us, and what we like now, is mirrored in the 3-part structure of the show and tell talk. What we did, how we did it, and what we learned. And just as recovering alcoholics use such narratives to support one another in recovery, quantified selfers use them to support one another's learning by providing for one another models of their individual learning. Finally, like AA stories, these stories are always narratives of transformation with the same kind of totemic power associated with such narratives. They're journeys from doubt, I didn't really buy into this quantified self stuff, to belief. One quantified selfer I talked to said, most people who are doing QS are doing it as a means of self-transformation. So you have to start with some kind of concept of the self in the future. And getting from here to there is essentially the creation of a personal narrative. Another said, it's when you share your story that you start to understand what it really means to give meaning to your data. Other communities have other genres and other ways of showing membership through the mastery of different forms of discourse. The most important question, though, is how learning how to talk the talk actually contributes to mastering the kinds of complex knowledge these people need to embark on their projects. Now, for me personally, the best illustration of this is the personal genomics service, 23andMe. So when you first log onto the website, to get your results, you are greeted with the words, "Welcome to you." But this "you" is actually quite complicated. So here's an excerpt from the page explaining my risk for colorectal cancer. And although the company does its best to present it in sort of clear and easy to understand a format, it's quite difficult for a non-scientist to interpret with much confidence. But there is a community to help. Learning in the 23andMe community involves not just learning who you are in terms of your genes, but learning who you are as a consumer of your genetic information and as a participant in a community of amateur geneticists. Now, one of the places learning happens is in the public discussion forums where 23andMe customers and other interested parties gather to discuss genetics, ancestry, medical research, and most of all, themselves. And where they also share information about their genomes with each other, just like Facebook users share photos and links. And by participating in this way, they gradually begin to develop certain ways of talking, certain ways of interacting this you. For example, one of the first things you notice is that people start identifying themselves in terms of genetic variants, as in this conversation about a variant for the gene CCR5. I'm DD, congrats. Anyone else DD? I'm also DD, DI. DD here as well. I'm DD too. I'm thrilled to be here. But the most important thing you learn is how to take on the identity of an expert and negotiate different possessions of expertise with other participants. Now, one of the key ways members start developing these expert identities is through the ethos in the community that values experiential expertise. So a certain kind of expertise is granted to people who have experience with certain conditions of health problems, who have relatives who have health problems. Even just possessing a particular genetic variant gives someone the right to speak from a position of expertise, as in, I'm DD and I've had the following experiences. The value placed on experiential expertise provides a means of legitimate peripheral participation for newcomers who've not yet developed more, quote unquote, scientific knowledge about genetics. Such participation may initially involve simply learning how to ask questions about genetic traits that have arisen from one's experience or test results, even if they're about such seemingly trivial matters as, crooked pinkies and gaps in the front teeth of one's relatives. Later participants learned to assert expertise based on their experiences, as in this example where a woman with cystic fibrosis offers herself up as an expert based on her experience with the disease, saying, if any of you have CF questions, let me know. I'm kinda a 29-year-old expert on the subject. And below this, where a woman insists that the Women's Health Study, which showed the negative effects of hormone replacement therapy, was wrong, because its findings are contradicted by her personal experience. We are the ones who live this experience and know it from the inside, she says. Now, as participants interact in the community, this experiential expertise gradually undergoes a transformation into something more resembling scientific expertise, as they start to learn how to bring other things they've learned from the internet and the media and other participants into their discussions, making connections between this external information and their own experience. And they also learn to talk about what they've learned, to characterize different kinds of information as research, to explore with other members the relative reliability of different sources of information. And as they engage in these negotiations of knowledge about their own test results and health problems, they begin mastering certain practices of intertextuality, providing links and abstract to specific papers on websites, but still inviting more expert members of the community to help them to interpret these texts. And if one participates long enough in these discussions, one gradually develops the ability to produce and interpret complex texts like this one. Let me give you just a second to see if you can understand this text. So what this participant produced here is really quite amazing. First, he introduces himself as an introduction by telling what variants of a particular gene under discussion that he has, GG and GT. Then he responds to an assertion by a previous poster that the AA variant of the gene makes people more sensitive to salt. Then, to support his argument, he produces a link to a paper from the online archive of the National Institutes of Health, from which he extracts quotes that show the relevant information, and then he flags the key point for the reader. And finally, he relates the findings in this paper to his own situation, concluding that he is genetically presupposed to be more sensitive to salt. Now, what's also amazing to me, even after my own brief participation in this community, is that I can actually understand this. Now, I took biology in high school and college, but I could never get too worked up about Mendel's P. And I could never relate to Drosophila. Remember Drosophila? Yeah? But when you're talking about me and my disease risk, suddenly learning becomes situated. Suddenly I have a reason to learn. And 23andMe even takes it a step further by actually getting their customers to take part in research by completing surveys about their traits that can be added to this huge data source of crowdsourced phenotypic information. And this makes me feel even more like an expert, like I'm actually contributing to science. But there's also a dark side to this. So just as with other social networking sites, the customers of companies like 23andMe are not just customers. They are also, in a very real sense, the products of these companies. The business model of 23andMe depends not just on selling personalized genetic risk information to individuals, but also on establishing a database of information which they can sell to universities, private laboratories, and pharmaceutical companies. In fact, 23andMe recently landed in hot water with some of their customers when they patented a variant of the SGK1 gene that may be protective against Parkinson's disease, which they discovered based on data given to them by their customers. Yes, they patented a gene, and some of the citizen researchers were not too pleased with this. One commenter on the 23andMe blog questioned whether this is really what he signed up for. If I'd known you might go that route with my data, I'm not sure I would have answered any surveys. Another accused the company of being disingenuous with all this talk about increasing human knowledge, benefiting sufferers, warning, trust is not something you can reclaim easily. While another characterized the practice as crowdsourced greed. So the last thing I'd like to talk about in the third dimension of health literacy is the critical dimension. The ability not just to participate, to be a critical participant in health practices, understanding whose agendas might be driving the kind of health device that's given to us, whose interests are being served when we use the apps that we use to track our moods or measure or our caloric intake. The machine is us, the machine is using us. This is a quote by the sociologist Michael Wersch that Christoph and I use to play to our students. But it seems to me especially relevant when we're talking about digital interfaces that are intimately interconnected with our bodies, monitoring our heartbeats, our brain waves, and at the same time connected to the manufacturers of these programs or devices who are often tracking us as we are tracking ourselves. And I was pleased to discover that these are also concerns that were actively being discussed by the quantified selfers at the conference I just came from. First of all, they were keenly aware that the algorithms underpinning many of the apps that they use are essentially ideologies written in code. That is, as Victoria pointed out, objects and apps have a kind of intentionality. One participant said, there's something about every app that by the way it contextualizes things, it already tells a story about you. So, for example, with Fitbit, the app already tells you that you're an active person trying to become even healthier. And the Lyft app tells you that you're someone who is social and wants to share goals with friends. So you need to decide if you want to accept this story. Another noted, it's a question of who defines the values. There's a design team that are making these apps and deciding what I should track and what I can say about it. But often for me, that's not good enough. In talking about some of the discursive affordances of these apps that I discussed before, they were actually very cautious. They gave comments like, the better it works, the more it constructs us in ways that are harder to control, and the more an app does, the more it does you. In general, there's a kind of distrust of the more corporate projects in self-quantification like Nike Plus, which come with sets of predetermined measurements. Nike calls them fuel points. And predetermined goals. One participant told me, I prefer an app that just gives me the data and says, okay, you figure it out. At the same time, there was an acknowledgement that for many people who lack the kind of geeky motivation to get out their Excel spreadsheets and figure it out for themselves, this sort of leaves the field ripe for this kind of corporate influence. There were also concerns about what happens to the data I collect, about who gets it once I share it. Now, I might not mind sharing my data with my Fitbit friends. Yeah? I might also want to share it with my doctor. That's great. But what about when my employer wants to start monitoring my steps? Watch out. And what about my insurance company? Yeah? Or what about some entertainment company that wants to tailor its product to my psychological state? You don't even need a Fitbit. Your iPhone already constantly collects information about your movements and locations. Will Google start tailoring my searches to my mood or my heart rate? And what about when governments want to collect this information for public health purposes? One of the people I met at this conference works for BBC. And he told me they're developing a system they call perceptive programming, which will allow your television to wirelessly gather information from a Fitbit or a heart monitor or a mobile phone or any other tracking device and use that information to alter the programming based on your particular physical or psychological state. Let me rephrase that. The state-run Broadcasting Corporation of Great Britain is developing a television set that can watch you. I'm sure that'll work out just fine. One of the most interesting people I met at this conference was the MIT anthropologist Natisha Dow-Schull, whose book Addiction by Design should be required reading for anyone interested in critical digital literacies. It's about how electronic slot machines are able to gather data about users' behavior and then alter when they let you in or make you lose in ways that are tailor-made to your habits and your personality in order to keep you playing as long as possible. And finally, there's Foucault. And we can't escape Foucault. So can it be argued that all this self-tracking is the ultimate in governmentality? That underneath all this talk of health is a disciplinary technology designed to control me by getting me to control myself. Actually, I'm not trying to scare you. In fact, the most interesting thing for me here is that people are having these kinds of conversations on a fairly regular basis, not just in academic context, but also in the media, in pubs, and especially within communities of gamers and hackers and self-quantifiers. So what's interesting is the capacity for communities like the Quantified Self movement to develop these on-the-fly critical literacies as new technologies arise. to even be able to usefully be critical about self-tracking or gaming or other digital literacies, we need to have these communities of users which, through their use, themselves create spaces for these conversations. And keeping these conversations from devolving into moral panics is so important, because every new tracking technology will bring with it new moral dilemmas and the need to have further conversations. So watch out. Now I'm tracking myself. But when I get my Google Glass, I'll have all sorts of new and fun ways to track you. Staff in the English department take notes. So what? Or perhaps more to the point, so what now? Are you all going to go out now and buy Fitbits? Yeah? Are you going to get your genomes sequenced?
Nope. No.
Is all this obsessive self-tracking actually doing me any good?
No.
Will it really make me healthier? Will it make me live longer? Or am I meticulously counting my steps to an early grave? Brought on by an increased stress due to this sort of hypochondria, well, what's now being called cyberchondria. More importantly, is what I'm quantifying really myself? Are these numbers I'm collecting me? Do they actually give me a truer and more accurate understanding of myself? After the psychologist Steven Pinker had his genome sequenced as part of the Human Genome Project, he mused about how much the information in his report didn't seem to apply to him. Like the fact that he has a gene that gives him typical odds of having red hair. And so he found himself not reading the report to find out about himself, but reading himself in order to interpret the report. I soon realized, he wrote, that I was using my knowledge of myself to make sense of the genetic readout, not the other way around. My novelty-seeking gene, for example, had been associated with a cluster of traits that include impulsivity, but I don't think I'm particularly impulsive. So I interpret the gene as the cause of my openness to experience. Now, does this mean that the information that Pinker's genetic test provided him is in some way inaccurate, or at least an inexact reflection of his phenotype? Well, maybe so. Does that make it any less useful for him? I argue not. For while one important function of text is to provide us an accurate representation of reality, whatever that is, this test performed another important function for Pinker. It turned around his gaze. It made him start looking at himself. It created a feedback loop. It's a bit like what my astrologer once told me. Okay, so I'm a bit embarrassed to admit that I go to an astrologer, especially after bragging about my data-driven life. But he's the husband of a good friend, and so. Anyway, in our first session, I asked him sarcastically if he was going to be able to tell me what was going to happen to me. To which he replied, "My job is not to tell you what's going to happen to you. My job is to help you to imagine the possibilities, to create a feedback loop." So every couple of hours, my iPhone asks me how I'm feeling, and I tell it. And then I take a picture of myself and add a tag of my own to characterize my mood, like optimistic or frustrated. And I sometimes wonder, when I'm snapping the picture, if the word I've typed is a reflection of what's showing on my face, or if I subconsciously alter my face to fit the word that I typed. And if I alter the look on my face, can I actually alter my mood?
Yes.
Now, this whole idea of reflexivity has lately become a hot topic in social theory. Critical realists like Margaret Archer argue that understanding reflexivity, understanding our unique ability to talk to ourselves, to conduct what she calls internal conversations, is a key way of understanding human agency in the face of the sometimes seemingly totalizing social structures that surround us. So maybe the quantified self movement, or even these more commercial products like Nike's Fuel Band, have something important to teach us about learning and feedback and reflexivity. When we compose texts about ourselves, digital or otherwise, we're in a very real sense composing ourselves and the world in which we live. My sense of myself as the protagonist in my ongoing story is conditioned by my understanding of my own capacities and potentials, an understanding that depends intimately on the technologies of self-contextualization I have available to me, whether it's an app, a diary, my own memories, or feedback from a friend. And it's with these technologies of contextualization that we're able to write our futures. is by making these texts of ourselves that we're able to make it count. Thank you. I'll just leave up Nike's ad. They are actually paying me for that. So Jackie?
Oh, there's
So,
yeah, okay.
I recently was reading some stuff where with digital technology, people are able to get little devices implanted. They're small enough to go through even your bloodstream, and they just collect continuous data on all of your chemical stuff. So, you don't need your device, it just sends it out. And one of the controversies of this stuff has been that right now, at least in America, the data is only legally seeable by your doctor, not yourself. So there's this issue about it. But one of the things they pointed out that I thought was very interesting is, our typical way of making medical generalizations are we sample over some period of time we've done it, but of course we don't sample 24 hours a day for 4 years. And what they're finding with that data is that lots of our generalizations are wrong. That the pattern you see when you sample relatively thinly the pattern is not correct, and the pattern you see when you sample very thickly is quite different. And that it's going to transform how we draw conclusions.
Absolutely.
So in some sense, where you may be just at the origins of a thing where it'll be incumbent on everybody to get this data, and then we'll all fight who gets to see it.
Yeah, getting to see it is a really important point, but take note. Yes, I'm a trendsetter. But I mean, so many good points in what you said. And one of the points is this kind of shift in medicine. This huge revolution in medicine from what was called sort of population-based medicine, where you did these kind of clinical trials, and you prescribe people drugs based on clinical trials with a whole bunch of other people who are not this person, to this kind of individualized medicine where I actually do have enough information about you, including genetic information that can tell me something about your response to different kinds of drugs, which can help me. And my father has heart disease, and he takes warfarin, which is a blood thinner, and he has terrible problems with bleeding. And they keep having to change his prescription. Now, when I got my genetic test, I found out that I have a gene that makes me highly reactive to warfarin. Right? And I suspect my father also has the same thing. If they had this information about him to begin with, then they would have saved a lot of time. But there's also this question of access to the information. And in medicine, this has always been a huge question. Even getting your medical records in some countries is really quite difficult. There's an interesting YouTube talk about a guy who has this defibrillating device in his heart that sends data to his doctor. Right? And the whole talk is about how his doctor gets this sort of constant data about his heart from this device implanted inside his body, but he can't get the data. He doesn't have access to that data. So that's a huge important question.
Yeah, it's also about the didn't have access to the resources to
Yes.
use the data. It's not just about the individual, it's about the social kinds of decisions
That's right.
that have to be made as well.
And that's the really complicated thing, because that's when you get into the algorithms. That's when you get into how these kinds of apps and other web pages and things like that transform data into ways that lay people can understand, and what happens in that whole process of transformation.
No, I meant something else. I meant the resources to pay for it, and which
Right,
people
of
in
course.
society
Yeah,
have access to those resources.
that's really key. I mean, that's really key, and I was thinking about that because I did go to this conference in Amsterdam, and it was basically a bunch of rich white guys at this conference. But there are some very, very interesting people who work in sort of public health and stuff like that. And I was talking to them, and I said, like, oh, we're just a bunch of rich white guys, aren't we? And one guy was saying, well, yeah, we are, but the thing about iPhones is that they do have the potential to bring health services to third world countries in some very, very interesting ways, because you don't have to have a doctor necessarily. You can give a sort of trained paramedic kind of person an iPhone to go out into villages to be able to do all sorts of things and be able to transmit that data wirelessly to hospitals and that sort of thing. So, I mean, I think even in third world situations, there are some, you know, potentials for this technology.
Technology involves monitoring sexual activity and not just HIV women, for example.
Yeah.
So there's a big issue about who can actually kind of have the critical digital literacy, particularly those who are having the health technologies done to them, as opposed to kind of doing it.
Exactly.
I was also interested in your learning community, because that seemed like the worst type of community ever. It's a whole bunch of people talking about themselves. I mean, is that that's the problem with most learning communities? Like, did you get any sense of perhaps people moving beyond just kind of being self-interested in?
Well, you know, this is a question that I've thought about a lot, and you know, comes up a lot in conversations I have with other people. You know, I've been accused of being solipsistic and narcissistic and self-centered, all of which is true. But I suppose the real question is that actually a bad thing for learning? And it might actually be a good thing for learning up to a certain point. So, for example, when I'm learning about Drosophila, I don't really care about genetics. But when I'm learning about microbial rectal cancer, then, you know, it's kind of important to me. But, I mean, there does develop in these communities, especially I think like the 23andMe community, this kind of ethos of sharing, right? So it's not just about me, it's about me sharing what I learned with you, right? So you can share what you learned with me and we can kind of learn from one another. So it's still all about me. But I'm hoping that you can help me find out about me, and if you help me find out about me, I'll help you find out about you. So it's reciprocal.
What was the gender balance at the conference?
It was, I would say, maybe 75% male, 25% female. So it was geeks, you know, male, white male geeks.
All Americans?
No, I mean, a lot of Europeans, a lot of Americans, a lot of South Americans, I found, a lot of Brazilians.
Is that what we call the alpha male complex? This is not male, but it's alpha male.
Alpha male. Is there something kind of macho about this? About wearing a lot of digital devices on your body? Well, I don't know. I mean, one thing I'm very interested in is the whole kind of way that this, in the future, might alter social interaction. I mean, not just things like Google Glass, but I mean, even things like, you know, so when you bring your date home from the bar, and you know, before bed you strap on your Zeo mind wave monitor to monitor your sleep. I mean, how do you explain these things? No, I actually know how many calories sex burns.
Those people don't need it, they're so narcissistic.
Well, I mean, and you know, I think this is an important kind of message I want to get from my talk, because there is this kind of discourse around self-quantifiers that it's all about narcissism. But what I found in talking to these people is what they were interested in was not so much themselves. What they were obsessed with was data. And it was themselves that was just sort of the mediational means they were using. So it wasn't that they were obsessed with themselves, they were kind of using their bodies as a video game or something like that, and playing with their bodies.
I'd be interested to hear you talk more about that, and specifically how this quantitative, qualitative divide breaks down in this context, where it is all about data, and as Roberto Samansky told us, you know, he sees digital media as this data love phenomenon that's permeating many aspects of culture. But this data is constantly qualitative, and it's only meaningful qualitatively and phenomenologically. So, but I want to hear you talk more about that tension, but also is there an awareness of that, interpretations, and how are multiple interpretations of data?
Interestingly, this was something that was talked about quite a lot at the conference. I mean, are we doing quantified self, or are we actually doing qualified self? That is, how important is this subjective aspect of the data? So, I mean, you look at something like the mood app I have, Right? What I'm doing is I'm taking something quite subjective, like my mood, and I'm quantifying it. And then the app itself qualifies it again by turning it into things like colors and expressions and things like this. And so I think that sort of movement back and forth from data. I don't like, I mean, it's interesting, the Chinese word for data actually means numbers. But I don't like this idea that data is always just numbers. Data is also words. But I think there's this back and forth thing between the quantification and the qualification is really a crucial thing to create meaning. And I mean, even in things like the show and tell talks, right? The narrativization of what you've done is really, it's an important part of it. It's not just a kind of add-on for them. It's part of the process, okay? So I quantify myself, I analyze the data, I come to some conclusion, but then I integrate that into a kind of narrative of myself, and most important, I tell that narrative to you, I share that narrative. Brian?
Thanks, Rob. It's really interesting. I can stand up so I can see you better. I've recently participated in a little experiment with a friend of mine who lives in Taipei. We were both trying to lose weight, and we agreed to use an app. It was a similar kind, it wasn't the same one you did, but it was a bit of a game as well, a contest between us, money involved, all that sort of thing. and hoping to motivate us. Yeah, and the interesting thing was it didn't have the same effect on each of us, and I was wondering if, because the young man talking at the conference really made me think of my friend in Taipei who has the success narrative that's come out of it, whereas I don't. And it was something that really sat with my life experience as well. I was skeptical that this would work for me because I tend to find quantification of that kind of thing detrimental to my ability to be healthy. I don't know what that is, but there's something about my psychology or something where I find that extremely destructive to my ability to lose weight or to whatever I'm trying to do. I seem to pull the other way all the time. And whereas for him it was very, so did you encounter any?
Two things I can say to that.
Yeah.
One is, there's an app for that. There are apps that have nothing to do with numbers at all. There are apps that involve, that are just total words, qualification. So sort of diary apps and so on. There's a very, very interesting web page actually called 750 Words, where you go to this web page and you write 750 words every day about yourself in this kind of free-form stream of consciousness kind of thing. Then it quantifies it though in a very interesting way. It has this algorithm that analyzes your words and tells you the kinds of things you're talking about and the kinds of preoccupations you have. But for me and for a lot of people at this conference, it's not necessarily the analysis that's the important thing. For a lot of people, it's the process that's the important thing. And what you were saying is the process. And you're saying for a lot of people, it's actually the process that helps. Right? So just keeping track of your food makes you eat less. Just carrying a pedometer makes you walk more. Right? But for others, it can have the opposite effect, and there are reasons for that. And I was telling you before I was reading this book about willpower, and one of the points that she makes is that when we have negative feelings, our first reaction is to seek pleasure. Right? So for a lot of people, the first reaction to feeling guilty that you haven't done something, or feeling guilty that you have done something, like you've eaten too much, is to eat more because that makes you feel better, because that's your kind of pleasure center. And, warning labels on cigarettes, not so much the warning labels, but these really disgusting warning labels that show like cancerous lungs and dead people and stuff like that. I mean, they're finding that this actually increases the amount that smokers smoke. Now, it may deter non-smokers from smoking, but it actually, because you look at that and you're like, what happens?
I can relate to that because the reason I suspected that this wouldn't work for me is because of a lifetime of trying to lose weight and finding, like, for example, daily weighing to be extremely detrimental. Monthly weighing is okay. Is that kind of thing where you need some time just to distance yourself from it and then just live a healthy way and then check back in later. And so this whole
you know, Weight Watchers thing and all that is never, you know,
Never
so that's why I was interested to hear what you say about that, yeah. But, so you're saying there is an awareness about that, that actually for some people.
There is an awareness, and I mean, even with this whole idea of chronotypes, I mean, what I think you're saying is not so much that it's not productive to weigh yourself at all.
Yeah.
Because by weighing yourself, you find out if you lost weight, and that can be motivating. If you haven't lost weight, that can be demotivating, of course. But it's about the timescales you'll be working on. That working on these very, very narrow timescales, you find makes you uncomfortable, whereas maybe widening out the chronotype might be useful.
So one of the things your talk brings up is the way that digital media has had a certain effect of creating individualism and niches rather than facilitating groups. So, and you see the same thing in education, because now we have the school of one.